In this video, Steve will be revisiting the bleachers asset, giving just a bit more control for an artist when setting up the stadium and the crowd. Now, in the very end of the last video, we spent just a few minutes talking about how an artist or a supervisor may take a look at the result of a digital asset or a tool and find that, it'd be fantastic if you could just add this small tweak. And in this particular case, the tweaks that we'd like to see would be control over the length of our benches, perhaps have them out just a little bit further so we don't have such a large gap up here. And what about the depth of these bleachers? Wow, there's just so much room. We could stack row after row of audience members on them. And then finally, digging through seeds, we found it a bit challenging finding the ultimate setup of our crowd distributed throughout all of the benches. So we've got as close as we possibly can, but now we'd like to have it such that an artist can feed in additional points for audience members to be copied to. So in this video, Steve is going to demonstrate how we would go about making these changes to our bleachers asset.
Cool. Well, the first two changes are going to be very easy. We've got our box that we use to build the benches. And so we can take that box, we can create two new parameters, one for controlling the width as a percentage, one for controlling the depth, and we can simply link those parameters up to the box. The third problem is not that tricky. It's a little bit more tricky than the dealing with the benches. What we're going to do, we're going to allow an artist to feed in some point information into the top of our asset, and we can take that point information along with the point information we were generating randomly, creating points that sit on each of our benches. We can merge that point information together such that our generated points and the artist place points will all get audience members assigned to.
Okay.
So let's deal with our benches first and then come back and take a look at adding extra points.
All right.
So I'm going to jump inside our bleachers asset, and then I'm going to right click and allow editing of contents. Now if we right click on this guy and come down to type properties, that is off the bottom of the capture region, and I'm just going to resize that slightly. I'm going to come over to the parameters tab, and on the bleachers tab I'm going to create two new float parameters, one for controlling bench width and one for controlling bench depth. So let's create a new float, probably underneath height and depth, and another new float. So this guy I will name to bench width, and this guy to bench depth. And if you recall, with our width, we're taking the maximum width, and I think currently we're multiplying it by something like 0.75. So if we were to multiply it from anywhere between just above 0 and 1, we'd have the full range of control. Also, you'll recall when we build these benches, we're building everything, we called it the unit bench. So our depth, our maximum depth would be 1. So again, if we take our bench depth and limit that between just above 0 and 1, we'll have the full range of control. So I'm going to take bench width and give it a range of 0.001 through to 1. And take bench depth and also give that the range of 0.001 through to 1. And with those in place, if we accept, we can now jump down inside our bleachers asset and hunt down the box that we use to create our bench. So let's hide other objects and space H to home up on our box. So this is going to be our depth. Our currently is 0.75. So if we were to simply set this to our bench depth parameter that we create, obviously everything's going to explode to begin with. If we then bring up our parameters, we can find our bleachers folder, and we've got our bench depth. We now have control over the bench depth. I am going to jump back down to the copy to cause our size in X to recook, just so that we can see a size in X. Fantastic. So now our size in X is controlling the total width of the bench, and yeah, we're taking 0.75 times whatever our maximum would be based on, I believe we were using the 2 points and finding the distance between the 2 points was the approach we took. So what if instead of hard coding 0.75, we take our bench width parameter and multiply that by everything else? So I'm going to take in size X for our bench box, get rid of 0.75, and replace that with our bench width parameter. And again, let's come down and look at the copies and then bring up the parameters for our asset. And if we start increasing bench width, we can go up to 100% or anywhere in between, and we have control over the depth of our benches as well. So I'm going to bring our visibility down to the final transform. And then let's deal with giving these parameter values that we feel work nicely. So I'm going to set the bench width to probably 0.85. Yeah, I really like that. And I'm going to set the bench depth, it's kind of close. I'm thinking 0.4 is probably going to be,
yeah, it's a lot better than what we had a few minutes ago, which was more or less just a table for them to sit on.
Yeah, so now we've got less gap in between this series of benches, and they're not as wide. They're kind of better sized for the audience members.
That's right.
So that's dealing with the benches. Now how are we going to deal with adding extra audience members? Well, let's jump up and take a look at our asset. We can't currently feed anything into our asset. When we built our asset, we said to have 0 inputs. But what we can do, we can right click, come down to type properties, and on the basic tab, we can change that setting of minimum inputs, maximum inputs. We obviously need one input, one to feed in our point data. But how do we know if that's a minimum input or a maximum input? Well, if we were to set our minimum inputs to 1 but our maximum inputs to 0, that doesn't make sense. How can we have less maximum inputs than our minimum inputs? We could set our maximum inputs to 1 and our minimum inputs to 1, but then we're saying we have to have that point data. We have to have a minimum of 1 input. Again, that's not what we want. We want optional point data. So if we set this to a minimum input of 0 but a maximum of 1, we can feed in 1 input of data if we want, but we're not forced to. The minimum inputs is 0, so if that input doesn't have anything wired into it, our node isn't going to cause an error. So we're going to set minimum inputs to 0, maximum inputs to 1. Also on the input-output tab, I'm going to change the input number 1 label from subnetwork input number 1 to something like optional audience points. And that's just a human readable label that we'll see when we middle click on that input. That label will appear up. Makes more sense than seeing subnetwork input 1. So if we accept this, we've now got an input on our asset. If we middle click, we see optional audience points. If we jump inside our asset, we'll see that optional audience points now comes in as an input to our asset, and we can take this and we can wire this into something. So where are we going to wire it? Well, I'm going to hunt down where we're dealing with our audience, and we take our audience points and we isolate them. And after we isolate them, we then run them through the point SOP to add the normals they need so we can copy our audience data to them. So what if, after we've isolated our points, but before we add the normals, we bring in the artist specified points and merge them together? We'll then add normals to all of our points, including the artist specified ones, and then copy our audience members to those points. So we've got our isolate audience template and that point SOP. I'm going to right click on the output of isolate audience template and wire into a merge SOP. Enter to accept that, enter to drop that into the network, and I'm going to rename this to merge optional points. We can then jump up and find our input, single left click on the output of that to grab a wire, and come back down to the merge that we just created, single left click to wire that into the merge. So now any data that we wire into the input of our asset is going to come down this wire and wire into our merge and be merged along with all the points that we're generating by the network. We'll apply the normals that they need so that everything's orientated correctly when we copy our audience to them, and then we'll copy our audience to them. So now we can jump.
You don't want to move that input all the way over there near the merge?
That would make a lot more sense.
You know, just so that it's, for readability, it's easier to trace the wires.
Sure. I mean, it's a personal preference. You sometimes may want to leave them at the top of the network because that's kind of also could make sense. But yeah, I'll bring that down.
And if you were going to leave it at the top of the network, I'd have just moved it all the way to the right-hand side. So you didn't have to trace the wire through all of the crowd of wires, if you will.
Cool. So jumping up, we can now wire in point data. And when we wire in that point data, anywhere we have a point, we'll also get an audience member created too. So I'm going to jump inside our bleachers and let's bring our visibility down so that we can see the stadium and everything. And then I'm going to jump up and create a curve. And if I template our bleachers and bring the visibility to the curve and also push space 2 to go into a top view and also bring up our handle tool, we can now start clicking and placing points on our benches. Now, granted, we're only dealing currently with the XZ plane, but we can create these points and then we can turn around and edit the points to position them correctly in Y. So this bench needs some more points creating, so I'm going to start here and just by hand add a series of points for audience members, something like that, and then maybe a couple in between these guys, and then maybe one down here. Looking over at this column, I think this bench could do with some audience members, so let's create some points.
And skip.
Down to around here?
Yeah. I was just leaving a little bit of space in there. I just don't want it to...
Maybe one on the end?
Yeah. Just don't want it to end up looking like just solid straight lines.
And then this bench, we could put a few up here. So let's put some up here. Maybe a cluster around here, and one on the end here. I'm also going to come down to this front bench and create a few on this bench.
Yeah, front's very important to keep in mind because we're going to have a camera do a very close sweep. That's going to pick everybody up on the front really well.
So even this bench I'd say is a little too sparse. So let's create a point here. I'll come back, create a point on that end. The rest of that column I'm happy with. Maybe this row and this row I'm not so happy with, and the ends of these rows. So let's create a point here. A couple of points here. I'm really going to add quite a lot to this row.
Now don't panic if you're thinking, what about this curve? It's the point data that we're interested in.
Yeah, this curve really is crazy. It's going all over the place, but it's the points that are essential. So let's create a point here, one here, and I'll create a little cluster on this end of this bench. And with that, if I push enter, I'm fairly happy with those points. But if we switch over to our perspective view, everything is sitting on the XZ plane. So what we can do, I'm going to right click on our component mode and come over to points. I'm then going to grab the move tool and start selecting a series of points. So let's grab all of these guys that need to go on the back bench. Let's go over, switch over to a top view again. Shift select these guys because they're going to be on the same position in Y. I think that's everything that's on the back bench. Yep. And then I'm going to switch over to a side view with space 3. We can see our top bench is up here. So let's slide these up in Y and sit them on the top bench. And then going to space 2 back over to a top view. And let's grab these guys on this row here. And following that around, there's no one else that sits on that row. And this is the third row down from the top. So space 3, 1, 2, third row down from the top. So let's bring those up. Make them sit on this row. Space 2 to jump back over to the top view. So we've positioned this row, this row, this row. So let's grab these front points. And they need to sit on the very first row, so space 3. The very first row we can see is here, so let's sit those up on the first row, space 2. This point needs to sit on the second row, space 3. So 1, 2. Space 2 back over to a top view. These points need to sit on the third row, space 3 to jump to a front view. So 1, 2, third row. Space 2. These points need to sit on the fourth row, control 2, deselect those guys. So these points are on the fourth row. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And finally, these points need to go on the second row down from the top. So let's put these on the second row down from the top. So right around there. So now if we push space 1 and come over to a perspective view, we can see the points are sitting on their corresponding benches. And if we take those points after they've been edited, so after they've been translated in Y, and feed those into our bleachers, if I untemplate and bring our visibility onto the bleachers, let's find this bench will prove a perfect example. We can see we have empty gaps as soon as we wire this edit in. we've now created audience members at all of those points.
And they're leaning over, looking down, so normals have been set up, everything's orientated properly, they're going to receive shading, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly, because of the way that we're merging those in, I should probably point that out. We're coming in and we're merging in those points, and those points are behaving exactly like the other points. So at this point, we don't have to worry about audience shader or the audience looking at the position because they're just points. It's when we come to the copy and the first input of the copy that we're dealing with the audience shader, the audience animation. So these points get treated exactly the same as our other points, which means that the audience members that get copied to our artist place points will still have the shader applied, they'll still get the random animation, and they'll still look at the object that we specify with our audience look at. So it really wasn't that hard at all to come in, position some extra points, and just fill in those few areas that our seed just didn't quite make to look right.
Yeah, and in this case here, Steve, as the technical director, has enhanced the tool so that an artist now can quickly get the look that the artist is looking for. Before, again, it was just struggling through a bunch of seeds, looking for, the right distribution of an audience. But now he can just get close and then simply create some points, send those points in, and everything works smoothly. So I believe that's everything that we wanted to cover in this video. Steve, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's absolutely everything.
All right, well, with that, that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks a lot.